So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Janna Johnson. She's an economic demographer with a PhD from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. She's currently an assistant professor in the Humphrey School of Public Policy at the University of Minnesota, an affiliate of the Minnesota Population Center. You may remember Steve was here from the Minnesota Population Center.
My boss, you know.
Also talking about the census. Well, Janna's research focuses on the causes and consequences of internal migration in the United States, but she also works on data quality issues, especially as they relate to U.S. Census data. She's currently a member of an advisory committee for the Census Bureau on methods for the demographic estimation of the 2020 census, and that's how I first met her when we were in this meeting in Washington last summer.
It was fun, actually.
Yeah. So her talk today actually focuses on the census and some of the issues that the undercount folks in the census have to deal with.
Yes.
So it's join me in welcoming Janna.
Thank you so much, Irma. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Irma said, like, I'm more of an economist than a demographer, but this is more of a demographic talk. So I'm really excited to get feedback from this audience on this paper, especially how to frame it, how to sell it, et cetera. So I haven't presented it in this form yet. So the other thing is, I don't know how you guys want to do questions. Like, okay. So I'm used to taking them during the talk, and I'll feel weird standing here like just talking and not. So please go ahead and raise your hand. But of course, if we get a little behind, which we probably will, we'll probably push it so go faster. Sound good? All right, great. So today we're going to be talking mostly about census undercount. And of course, this is becoming more of an issue on the public consciousness in the lead up to the next census. But the Bureau has measured census coverage, and which they call undercount, for decades using various methods. The method I'll be using is called demographic analysis, or it's a variant of demographic analysis, and that's been used since about 1960. So previous studies have looked at, so of course the Bureau measures undercount, puts out papers on measuring the undercount, things like that. They don't do so much on the implications for internally to the Bureau, but there has been some work by people outside of the Bureau looking at the implications of decennial census counts for things like congressional apportionment and funding allocation. But we don't know very much at all about the implications of undercount for social science research using census data. And so that's the focus of this paper is to look at that. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first estimate the undercount of a particular population. I'll explain more about why I focus on this population in a bit, which is native-born children. So these are children born in the United States, which means they have a birth certificate, a U.S. birth certificate, aged between the ages of 0 and 5. And I'm only going to look at the 1990 and 2000 censuses because of data limitations. I'm also, in contrast to the Bureau, I'm going to be using my census estimates of the population are going to come from the PUMS, of course, IPUMS USA, because obviously, given where I am. And so that's going to be a little different. And of course, I use that because that's what we all use when we use census data. In addition to estimating undercount using for the different characteristics reported by the Bureau, I'm also going to go a little farther and estimate undercount by state of birth and show you how undercount varies that way. So that's the first part of the paper. The second part is about the implications of this undercount for research. And the outcome that I focus on, since I'm looking at young kids, there's not much there that we can look at. And so I chose to look at child poverty. What fraction of this population is below the federal poverty line. And the way I do that is I'm going to adjust the person weights that are provided in the PUMS for undercount, both just using my estimates directly as well as applying some assumptions about relative undercount rates of different groups. I'll show you those implications for child poverty rates at both the state and national level. And then I will also show you a little bit of how adjusting these weights affects the estimation of differences in poverty rates between racial and ethnic groups using a regression analysis, because that's, you know, my whole point is like, how does this matter for running regressions using the data? So just show you where we're headed here. So reassuringly, using IPUMs, the counts generated from the PUMs, I get similar undercount rates for the native-born kids as reported by census. But there's one big exception, which we'll talk about more in detail. There is a large variation in undercount of children by state of birth. It's pretty striking. We'll talk more about that, of course. And then, so adjusting weights by the state of birth, poverty, and Hispanic status does affect the measurement of child poverty. It increases my preferred specification here, in terms of my preferred, weight adjustment scheme, increases child poverty rates by 2.1 percentage points in 1990 and 1.6 in 2000, off of a base of about 20%. And the conclusions from regressions comparing the likelihood of child poverty by race and ethnic group change in some cases, particularly, so not in all cases, which is also good. So if the undercount is modest, it doesn't matter much. So that's good news for all of us. But if the undercount is correlated with both poverty and Hispanic status, stuff starts moving around. Okay, so what's been done? I've talked a little bit about this already. So we know some stuff about the undercount of kids. We know that we miss them a lot, right? And we've missed them for many, many censuses going back. My colleague Dave Hacker has shown even some of the very early censuses, child undercount is particularly high. And we also know from work from the Bureau, these are all internal Bureau reports, that undercount does appear to be higher for minorities and those of lower socioeconomic status. However, it's still pretty much an open question in terms of why. Why do we miss so many kids? And so this paper is not focused on answering that question. I encourage, PhD students, this would be a great thing to think about here, is why do we miss so many young kids? There are two potential explanations which I can talk about later, but nobody's really shown which or both have the effects. There's been work on implications of population undercount, which I kind of referred to earlier, particularly like this paper. It's older. But it looked at, it was published in JASA, looking at, the 1990 census was a particularly high undercount census. What would have happened to congressional apportionment if we were to account for the undercount and the apportionment? And it would have changed, I think, 2 seats of representatives across the states, which is not insubstantial, right? Particularly for the affected states. A little bit on federal funding allocation, but that's a bit hard because that's often done at a more local level. But besides that, we know very little about the implications of undercount for research. This is a very recent unpublished paper yet. It's a job market paper out of the Kennedy School, she looks at the showing the implications of undercount of African American males, which is the other group that we miss a lot of. We miss a lot of kids of all race and ethnicities, young children in particular, which is the group I'm looking at, and then we miss a lot of African American men between the ages of 18 and 40. And so it's a pretty cool thing. She did a good job and showed that it does matter for measuring race and ethnic differences and stuff. Okay, so this is a little small for many of you, apologize. This is just showing you how bad is the undercount of kids. So this is census undercount by race. You notice here, these are the races we can do undercount for, Blacks and non-Blacks. And the reason is these are the only races that we think we can confidently distinguish and are on both on the birth records, the death records, and the census. It's unfortunate. I've tried to, if you try to go any deeper than this though, things start getting pretty interesting. Yeah.
Is this census information?
Yes, this is taken from the census. This is not my estimates. This is the official demographic analysis estimates reported from the Bureau. So this is the entire population, not just the native born. But you can see, like I mentioned, 1990 was a little rough in general. So this is for the non-Black population. You see kids under 5, undercounted almost 3%, the full population 1%. 2010, we pretty much nailed the full count. That, of course, doesn't mean that we didn't have differential undercount and overcount. I mean, they all canceled themselves out. And you still see here, you know, the undercount of kids actually grew over that time period. And this is real bad in 1990, but still, even though we've counted African American or Blacks here as distinguished from African Americans, you know, it's the undercount has fallen. Undercount of kids is still pretty dang high. Okay, so how do I estimate undercount here? I'm using a method called demographic analysis, which should all be very familiar to us demographers here. Births and deaths, immigration. But so this is my measure of undercount. It's percent net undercount. What you do here, so this DE, that's our demographic estimate, which is pulled from birth and death records, which I'll describe a little bit more here. You take the difference between that and the estimate of that population as recorded in the census, divide it by demographic estimate, multiply it by 100, you get your percent net undercount. So it's positive if the population's undercounted, negative if it's overcounted. I'm not going to go into much detail about how I do this exactly, but I follow in general what the Bureau does, with the exception of for the population I'm looking at, I'm going to estimate the population simply using births minus deaths. I'm going to ignore migration because, again, these are super young and so they haven't had much time to move around. And also, I'm only looking at the native born. So I'm not having to worry about in-migration from outside the country. Of course, this is, you know, but another reason why we're doing this is that migration measures are really messy. And so, but fortunately, simply using this, I get values that are pretty close to what census reports for the full population. Again, as I mentioned this before, my census estimate is drawn from the PUMs. And so again, I say native born only. You're born in the 50 US states or and DC. So here, another thing that I do, because of the way that the census estimate is formed, I can calculate standard errors on my estimate of undercount, which the Bureau doesn't really do because they use the 100% counts, and that's one number. I get those from, you know, just the fact that this is a weighted, and so you get a band there. And so my undercount is significantly different from 0 if the demographic estimate falls outside of the 95% confidence band on the census estimate. Yeah.
But you're getting the census count from the sample, no? And so
yeah, I apply the weights.
So is there a difference between talking about the undercount or talking about whether the weights are wrong?
Well, the weights don't account for the undercount, right? But you're right. This is something that I haven't looked at in terms of how well do my counts match the full counts. But I mean, the weights are designed, right, to use the 5% in order to match the full 100% counts, the tabulations. So that's what I'm going with.
The thing is that, you know, there's a conceptually you can think about the undercount as they miss the kids, and the other it's different if they calculate the weights wrong. So you know, but
yeah. So the weights are going to be affected by the undercount in that the full 100% counts are wrong, right? But assuming that, I mean, but again, like weights, the Census Bureau weights are, I think we were talking about this, they're kind of a black box. I'm using them and, you know, assuming everything is done correctly, which, you know, like it should match the full 100%. Yeah.
Just having a little hard time following what maybe what strikes me as implicit, maybe you make it a little more explicit.
I'll try.
You can calculate standard errors, but
yeah.
another way to say it is you have to calculate standard errors.
Yes.
Because, I mean, this whole business about testing whether something's significant or not, I don't really get that, because the total error is the bias and the sampling error. When you don't least in theory, have sampling error, you don't worry about it, but it's not really clear
Yeah.
what you're testing the bias against. It seems like a little bit of sleight of hand to somehow claim.
So you're right. I'm not, sorry to interrupt, but I completely understand where you're going here. So actually, my estimates are a sample, right? Because I'm looking particularly at the native-born population. Native-born is the place of birth is only collected on the long form, which is a sample, right? We can't get 100% native counts because we don't collect that for the entire population. Right, so there is a sampling error associated with measures of the native-born population because it's drawn from the long form. Does that help? Okay, well, that's what I got.
Because, well, I mean, because it seems to me that if you have the, you know, you thought you had the complete count,
Which I don't.
right, the sampling doesn't matter.
You're right.
We interpret the loss of children from some kind of bias to something that has to do with sampling, strikes me as a sleight of hand.
Well, I'm certainly not trying to do a sleight of hand. I'm just trying to say, well, okay, there is some sampling bias in the census counts because it is drawn from a sample. I'm just saying, you know, do the demographic estimates that we get from, you know, a full count, which is drawn from the births and deaths. Does that lie within the 95% confidence band, which is generated from the sampling, you know, bias or whatever, however you want to call it, sampling variation of those native-born counts. That's simply all I'm doing.
You're benchmarking bias against sampling.
I'd be curious to know how you'd like me to do it differently. Okay. Okay. All right. So this is what I do. I'm going to give you what I've got from by single year of age, looking at ages 0 through 5, by sex and by our two races, black and non-black, for 90 and 2000. Again, those are the only 2 years I can do here because you need the long form in order to get native born, which we only had up until 2000, and we also need state of birth on the birth records, which only started in 89. So, or actually only started in 78 or 79, sorry, so we can't really do 1980 for this full age group. Yes?
The census, on the previous slide, you had census estimates.
Uh-huh.
They basically use this same formula that what 100% census.
Yes, and they try to account for, their demographic estimate also includes estimates of migration in order to account for that, which I think are pretty rough, because we simply don't have very good measures of all the components of migration that we need. So.
And what do we know about the accuracy of the vital statistics?
Great point. I am following what the Bureau does and assuming that they are 100% accurate. The further back in time you go, the less accurate they are. But fortunately, the earliest time period I use here is 1985. I think prior to the early 80s and earlier, the Bureau upward adjusts African American births to try to account for under-registration of births, but after that, they assume 100%. So I'm just gonna follow what others have done here and assume 100% accuracy. Of course, that's not true, but it's what we got. For young kids, again, almost all of the component almost all of the demographic analysis estimate for young children is births, right? Because deaths are so as long as the births are fairly okay, then.
I think the births are probably recorded. My guess is that we have birth records, that there's not a final reporting of births anymore. What may be different is whether the mother is accurately reporting her place of birth.
Yeah, I'm not using mother's place of birth here. You're absolutely right that is probably not accurately reported, but I don't use that here. I'm only looking at where the child itself is born. And the child is born in the U.S. It is in my sample. It doesn't matter where their parents were born. They're born in the U.S. I've got them. Okay.
You talk about the ethnicity of the mother is also
problematic.
birth certificate than the census.
So I tried to do this in an earlier version of the paper, and then maybe, or I don't remember if you went to my talk when I gave it at the Bureau, but I tried to do this. The issue is, I mean, there's plenty of issues related to accuracy of ethnicity on the birth and death records. What's in terms of the mother, what's more problematic or difficult is accurately identifying the mother of the child in the census. And that I figured out that it's not very possible, but I tried.
You are reminded that the census produces these counts, and they claim that these are full counts. You're actually watching whether having all these estimates, and you actually watching that full count of it before.
So these things, my estimates are not directly comparable with censuses because, again, censuses is for the full population, and I'm only looking at the native born. But for these young kids, they're pretty close, right? Because again, they haven't been around on the earth long enough to have a lot of them move around. Yeah. I want to get to the implications here. So.
I think your point is how do whatever that outcome may be, how they actually estimate.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. Yes, for sure. Okay, so I think I've already kind of covered this. Okay, so here is my undercount of native-born kids for 1990. I'd like you to notice the scale here. The orange here is our blacks. The blue is non-blacks. You can see first thing here, boys and girls are pretty much the same. Which is not surprising given their ages here. They're all kids. What should jump out to you here is what's going on here, right? These are kids under the age of 1. The PUMS in 1990 is missing about 1/3 of black babies and about 20% of non-blacks. This is because the age question in 1990 was confusing to a lot of people in terms of how do I enter the age of a kid who's less than the age 1 year. And so it generated this. The 100% counts, Census figured this out and they corrected the 100% counts for this, but you can't add people to the PUMS. And so this is something that has been known about but hasn't been documented before. And you can see that some of what happened here is that people were like, well, I'm just going to write down the age in months in this box, or I'm just going to call the kid age 1, right? So you see this technically this should probably be up here with the other guys, but and you also see it if you do it out to age 10 and stuff. You see like probably some of these kids are recorded as 10-year-olds and are actually 10-month-olds, things like that. But it's certainly not enough to account for this. Like we're definitely missing a lot of these kids in the PUMS. Yeah.
Didn't ask year and month instead of they just simply ask mother to count the age?
Yeah, it was just it was confusingly worded in 1990. You can look at the form and see. But this is, again, it's in the technical documentation of the 90 census. They figured this out and they corrected the 100% counts. But again, PUMS can't be corrected as easily, I guess, so they decided not to do it. But still, after we consider that, we see here about 10% of black kids between the ages of 1 and 5 are missed. And here, it's probably on average about 3%. Moving to 2000, they fixed the age question. So my scale here, has been cut in half. But once again, we see, and actually these aren't, well, they probably actually are statistically significantly different. But again, the undercount of blacks is higher than that of non-blacks, but it decreases with age.
Just to go back to the last one.
Yeah.
So the less than 0, and you said that they corrected the close to 100%.
The tabulations.
Yeah, I have a recollection, and you may or may not be right, but I don't think they've been able to do the corrections all across all the local areas. And so,
You're probably right.
So that, people shouldn't feel like this is gone if you Because that's how I stumbled on it once upon a time.
Yeah.
In local areas.
Yeah, well, I stumbled upon it because I got this, and I was like, what?
Right, but I don't think it's been corrected, you know, once you drill down.
I think you're probably right. Yeah. So if you're using the 90 census, even the tabulations, I'd encourage you to check the technical docs. All right. Now I'll show you the newer stuff here. So this matches. You're just gonna have to take my word for it. It matches what Census gets pretty good, which is great. I didn't put it on the slide here. And also, Census usually doesn't report single year of age. They only report 5-year age groups, so it's hard to compare exactly. I'm no longer going to distinguish between boys and girls here because I showed you they're pretty much the same. I calculate undercount by state of birth, and I split out age 0 from 1 to 5 because of that issue in 1990, and I'm going to show you ages 1 to 5. Because as you'll see, this map would be entirely red. I can show you it if you want. But this is non-blacks, age 1 to 5 in 1990. The darker color of the state, the higher the undercount. I know this is small. So those southwestern states have between a 5 and a 10% undercount of non-blacks. Also see undercount here, up in New York and New Jersey as well. Iowa had a significant overcount. So I'll show you in a second here. Here's blacks. I wouldn't worry too much about missing Montana. There's like 5 of them. But you see, particularly like some of these states that also had high non-black undercounts, like California, Arizona, Florida, also have relatively high undercount rates of blacks, but particularly the Northeast here. Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York miss a lot of black kids. Similar patterns in 2000. This seems to be a pretty constant thing over time in terms of how these state of birth patterns look. Again, the overall undercount in 2000 was much lower, so there's much less statistical significance here in many of these states, and we don't see Montana anymore. And we also see overcounts in a lot of very small black population states. Excuse me. But once again, the Northeast jumps out as well as some of these large southern states as well. And so here's all of them together, so you can just kind of see the patterns here.
So Mississippi would be one of the highest proportion of African American states. It might be the highest. I don't know.
I think it is.
So they just get overcount.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're counting their population. I would call that pretty well. Because it's a small. All of these overcounts are pretty small, until you get to like.
At first, I was wondering if it was correlated with the percent, but it's almost.
It's not with the black. Of course.
When you do the state estimates, I mean, you work on internal migration as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the state.
Mm-hmm.
So you take how do you know if they move?
State of birth is the same. So this is this is by state of birth.
So it might be that
they
don't live in that state anymore.
Yes, it might be, but I think I looked at this. It's over 90% still live in their state of birth.
Because that, in the census, I thought they would have moved.
Yeah. I just but your state of birth stays. So this is problematic for DC. Like the DC estimates are all over the place and I think a lot of that is that if you were born in a DC hospital, you may put down your place of birth as Virginia if you were living in Virginia at the time, even though your birth certificate says DC. So I'm going to show you my Hispanic stuff. So in 2000, for a lot of these states, this isn't the greatest table in the world, but I'm going to show it to you guys because we've talked, I think you're interested in it, but it's not the main point of the paper. How long do we go till? Shit, okay. All right, so I look at the states with significant non-black undercount. So, and this table is sorted by percent Hispanic white in 2000, drawn from the census, so that's this column. here I've done for you, what is the ratio of, so I've calculated, so 2000, most of these states, we have Hispanic on the birth certificate, so we can kind of look at this, can't do it in 90. We can look at the relative undercount rates of non-Hispanic non-blacks and Hispanic non-blacks. Like New Mexico, this is incredible, right? Non-Hispanic non-blacks undercounted at almost 9%. Hispanic non-blacks are actually, that's not statistically significant. Bold means not statistically significant. So in this very high Hispanic state, we're counting Hispanics pretty dang well. The people who are undercounted here are the non-Hispanics. But then we move into places like California, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and we see that Hispanics are undercounted at about approximately 2 times the rate of non-Hispanics. So, but this ratio isn't constant across states of birth. Like Nevada or Florida, we see similar sort of thing to New Mexico. So that's just, again, some of these counts I don't, this breakdown I don't trust for some of the states. Like I don't really trust it for New York because there's, it's over 10% of the births have missing Hispanic status. So here I've just allocated that, assuming it was the same, missing conditionally at random, but that's probably an implausible assumption here. Yeah?
You might explain.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that they missed the birth or they missed the household?
So they're... So yeah, you're getting into like, why do we miss kids in the census? Like this is still a mystery, but there are 2 explanations as to why we miss kids. Number 1 is filling out the form, get bored, filling out the form, just not gonna put in the youngest kid in the household, right? Stop after filling in the parents. So there we would count the parents, we count most of the household, but we would miss the children. So that's one way that this could be generated. The other one is that we're just missing the entire household, right? And we don't see it at the older ages because of overcount of other parts of the population canceling it out. And so the kids are kind of the canary in the coal mine sort of thing here. There's one paper, and I'm happy to share it because it's kind of hard to find because it's an internal census paper that they released last year that tried to get at this kind of indirectly, and I'm not super confident in the evidence here, but what they were saying in terms of undercount for the ACS, that both of these things are at play in terms of the explanations, right? Some people we're capturing the household, but not the kid, and sometimes we're missing the entire household. So, open question, guys, if you figure out a better way to get at it. Yeah, so it's the explanation for these patterns. Oops, crap. Sorry, I'm in my appendix slides. This is 1990. This is so there you can see 1990, like why I didn't show you age 0. So yeah, so the explanation for this pattern here isn't just that we're undercounting Hispanics at a higher rate. Like there's some other stuff going on as well. All right, so here's into how I do this for adjusting weights for the undercount. And it's, for me, who's not particularly good at math, it took me a while to figure this out. So I hope I'm doing it okay here. If you have any suggestions as to how I should do it differently, that'd be great. All right, so in general, what I'm gonna do here is I wanna increase the person weights that are provided in the POMs for people who look like the people who are undercounted. Right, so what I've got here is I've got an undercount measure, which I put 4 subscripts on there, because it's by year, by age group, I do 0 and 1 to 5. Race R, that's my black and non-black, and the state of birth. My basic adjustment, I'm gonna call it mega state of birth. Which is just going to take the person rates provided, which are the W in the POMs, and I'm going to multiply it by 1 plus the undercount, right? So if the undercount is 4%, it's going to be multiplied by 1.04. So that's great. However, we know that undercount is higher for people who are, of lower socioeconomic status, people in poverty. We know it's higher for Hispanics, but we can't measure it by these characteristics using this method. So what I'm going to do there is to just sort of kind of do this exercise. How much could this be affecting measures of poverty and relative poverty? I'm going to assume some different relative undercount rates between those in poverty and those below the poverty line and above the poverty line, and for Hispanic and non-Hispanic, non-blacks. And adjust the weights according to these assumptions and see what happens. So here are my weight adjustment schemes, right? Because I'm going to be reporting values based on these different schemes. I call census. Those are just using the provided person weights in the census. State of birth. Those are the ones I just described. Hispanic. My Hispanic scheme is going to adjust using the state of birth undercount. And assuming that there's some difference in the relative undercount rate of Hispanic non-blacks and non-Hispanic non-blacks. And those differences are going to go two times, double undercount, triple, all the way up. And I'm going to do a super extreme example of 10 times, just to see what happens. And I'll do the same thing for those in poverty and outside of poverty. Again, super crude, right? Assuming that undercount is so binary this way versus whether you fall below this arbitrary poverty threshold and above, but for a simple example, that's what I'm going to do. Okay. Here is what happens to national child poverty rates using our different weighting schemes in 1990. Right, so you see here, remember 1990 was the high undercount census. If we adjust it state of birth, we're already increasing the poverty rate by almost half a percentage point. Again, these are small effects, but fortunately, right? But they're there. And as we adjust for the Hispanic status, double, triple, and so on, it's not changing so much anymore. So that's kind of good. I'm going to squish it down, right, and expand my scale here so I can show you the poverty adjusted measures on the same graph. So here those are. And so if we start assuming, say that, and this is where I get that 2.1 percentage points, if I use the 5 times, right, say people who are in poverty are 5 times more likely to be undercounted than those above the poverty line, that's where we get that increase in the poverty rate of 2.1 percentage points relative to the census measure. All right? And that's just some numbers here in terms of how many kids we're actually adding to the poverty population. It's going to look similar for 2000, except here, again, the overall undercount rate was smaller, so we don't get as large of a jump when we just do the pure state of birth adjustment. We get a bit of a larger change, a relative change when we do the Hispanic adjustment, because again, here the Hispanic population has grown pretty substantially between 1990 and 2000. Again, similar sort of, pretty much looks the same. This is going to be hard to see. I apologize for this, but I was trying to figure out the best way to do this, and this is looking at state child poverty rates. So this is the state, and I've sorted this for, these are high Hispanic states, right? So I put the US at the top, and these are the poverty rates under those schemes. And I put that in a red box if it's statistically significantly different from the census rate. And so you see here, 1990, they're all different. 2000, once we start adding the double Hispanic. And you see, New Mexico, right? Remember New Mexico, actually the undercount rate was actually lower, right? And so there, and it's also a small state, right? Small population state, so it's not changing anything. It's different when we get to California and Texas, right? So we start assuming high relative undercount rates of Hispanics, we get statistically different poverty rates. And in 1990, the same happened for Illinois. Actually, we had, even if you just do the raw state of birth adjustment, it changed stuff. But 1990, again, was the high undercount, overall undercount census. And so we also see changes in Florida, New York, New Jersey. This is for poverty adjusted, and it's not in color because I didn't get around to it. And this is the entire country. I just want to show you it to just show you how much it mattered. And this is sorted by population size of the state. So this is using the poverty adjustment. See here, right? It matters for a lot more states. Once we get up into say the 3 times, right? But it does seem to matter, the smaller adjustments matter more for the large states, as we would expect. And here's just at the top, right? The top population states, here's the middle, here's the bottom, right? So I guess the moral of the story here is it's gonna, of course, the standard errors are smaller on the bigger states, and so therefore we get differences even with the smaller adjustments. All right, so here's, that's great, seems to matter. Like once we start making some assumptions about the relative undercount rates of Hispanics and those in poverty, changes, steps, there's, I would say, so the changes are fairly small in terms of magnitude, but they do seem to be statistically significant. All right, so here's like the big question that I was interested in answering here. When we estimate a basic regression, does using the different adjusted weights, does it change our conclusions or change the values of the coefficients? So I'm just going to use a very simple example here. I'm not saying this is the right thing to do, but it's a simple example. I'm just going to regress an indicator for whether you're in poverty on an indicator for being Black, indicator for being Hispanic. Of course, the excluded group here is going to be non-Hispanic, non-Blacks. I'm going to include a bunch of control variables and see what happens. We're gonna estimate this using the different weighting schemes, see what happens to the values of delta B and delta H. Make sense?
What year are you doing?
I'm gonna do it in both 1990 and 2000. I'm also gonna add a couple additional weighting schemes, right? And I estimated the poverty rates using these schemes as well, but you get the same answer, and I'll tell as some other ones, so I'll tell you what's going on here. So the question is, well, what if, undercount is correlated with both of these things, undercount and Hispanic status, or excuse me, poverty and Hispanic status. So I just chose a couple here to show you. So the way I do this is I take the poverty rate, my poverty weights, and I adjust those for a relative undercount of Hispanics, using a similar sort of procedure as I did the original ones. And so this captures, attempts to capture this, the correlation between both, or both of these correlations happening at the same time. So, okay, so here's 1990, and what I'm showing you here is the coefficient value. This is that delta B, this is that delta H, and using census, state of birth, adjustment, and then all the way up. This is just the pure Hispanic adjustment. See, it doesn't really matter, interestingly, right? These coefficients are pretty much exactly the same. The stuff starts changing around a little bit when you start adjusting it by poverty. You see these coefficients go up, and the Hispanic non-Black goes up a little faster, right? Then, but terms of the conclusion about like the relative poverty rate of Blacks is higher than Hispanics, that doesn't seem to change, but you see the difference here once we get to these extreme examples, shrinks a bit. Now I'm going to show you the two-way weight adjusted weights. So here are, again, census estimate, the state of birth estimate, and I've left the 2 times poverty and the 5 times poverty on there, because those are the ones that I take the 2 times poverty weights and I adjust them for 2 times Hispanic and 5 times Hispanic, similar here. So now I'm going to show you those. And you see there, adjusting the 2 times poverty doesn't seem to matter so much, but if we get into this more extreme undercount correlation, we see that, the difference between the coefficient on Black and the coefficient on Hispanic shrinks even more rapidly with this two-way adjustment. And the results are pretty much the same for looking at the 2000. Just doing the same sort of procedure here. Okay? So I've left time for questions, which is amazing. And I'm looking forward to discussing all this with you guys. So just to conclude here on the undercount of young children varies substantially by state of birth. Showed you that, and it seems to be, this pattern seems to be fairly consistent, at least across the 1990 and 2000 censuses. This really highlights the importance of measuring undercount by other characteristics beyond race and age. But that is not easy. Again, we're kind of stuck with what's recorded on the birth certificate that we can match well to what's recorded in the census. We're pretty limited in using this method. Adjusting person weights for undercount does affect measures of child poverty. Depending on the assumptions you make about the relative undercount rates, these effects can be modest or they can be pretty large. Adjusting for variation by Hispanic status only doesn't seem to matter a whole lot in this application. But when you combine that with the poverty as well, we saw that those regression coefficients did seem to change more. I'd also like to highlight here, undercount is not just a decennial census issue. I've shown you, the reason I've focused on the decennial, I would love to be able to do this for the ACS, but census, so Vital Statistics stopped releasing state of birth on the birth records in like 2004. So you have to like go to the RDC to get them, which is kind of lame, but it's the way it is. And also the ACS has a rolling sampling frame, which makes demographic analysis pretty impossible because the decennial is nice, measures the population as of a point in time, which is nice for measuring births and deaths, right? But with the rolling sampling frame of the ACS, it's whose guess, in terms of, it depends on, there's cyclicality in births and deaths, there's and then, when the survey is fielded, who's born and who's died and all that. But again, it's very likely that these same issues plague the ACS and the CPS and all other surveys. It's just much harder to measure.
Well, another thing you can add about that is that it's sort of a peculiar problem in the ACS becomes most obvious when you're dealing with age.
Yes.
Because whenever I complain to people, the ACS is too slow, they say, well, pull it across years. But if you're trying to measure single years and the error is differential across the single years, it all falls apart.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't really understand the multiple year ACS estimates for a similar sort of reason like this.
Okay, if you don't,
yeah.
If you sort of believe there's some localness in time.
Yep.
But one thing there is a localness.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, I use the ACS quite a lot in my migration work because but yeah, like I never use the 3 year or the 5 year because well, what is this migration measure? Like, when you pool it over, you're asking people, did you move in the last year? And then you're pooling stuff over 3 or 5 years. Like, yeah. So ACS is great, but it's got some issues like this. So yeah, my takeaway from this is that, we should think carefully about the potential effects of undercount in our research using data where we think that we've got it, which is pretty much everything, especially when your research focuses on undercounted populations, which is often a very interesting and important area of research, right, on poverty in children and minorities, or if you are comparing populations with differing undercount rates, which is pretty much, and then of course, I'm just going to put down there. What's going on? Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments. Yeah, Emilio.
No, very interesting. I have two comments. One is I don't notice anything that in the birth certificate and the vital registration, the ethnicity of the birth is the ethnicity of the mother. And the Hispanic ethnicity, tends to come from last name.
Yes.
Tends to be from the father.
Yes,
So I wonder-
you're talking about in the census, right?
Well, it's socially.
Yeah, and actually, Amelia, can I correct you for just a second? So actually what the Census Bureau does when they assign race to the births, they use the father's race if it's reported, and then they use the mother's race if the father's race and ethnicity is not reported. So they do try to correspond in that way.
Something about where ethnicity comes from.
Yeah, you're right.
And I don't know if there's something to say about that when combining these data sources. The other comment is about, I wonder if you thought about, because these are U.S. born births, but the mother or the household could be foreign born.
That's absolutely right.
And I wonder how much of these come from missing immigrant households. And I'm saying this because the case of New Mexico for Hispanics is interesting.
Yeah, we'll go back to that.
A lot of Hispanics, but relatively few immigrants.
Yes.
Whereas,
Sure.
in looking at data on fertility of Hispanic fertility, a lot has to do with the percent foreign born of Hispanics. A lot of the error actually came from immigrants, and I wonder if you can incorporate that.
Yeah, I'd love to think about that. It's just the other thing I've thought about is like, this is super fascinating, and I want to dig into this more. But it's like beyond the scope of what I want to do in this paper. But I think it's totally fascinating, and I want to think more about that in terms of, and maybe that could help us get at, are we missing whole households or are we missing just the kids? For sure.
You could look that I add something like report on Hispanic who are foreign born.
Yeah, I could put that in another column here. Yeah.
And actually, percent foreign born and the change between because these institutions, you mentioned that they were not recording Hispanic ethnicity in many of the states, and then so suddenly in the middle of the 90s, they
started adding it.
discovered that they're getting a lot of Hispanics. So that even just the growth of the Hispanic also had an effect on their statistics.
Yeah, so like growth between 1990 and 2000. Yeah, that's a good point.
I know one data question.
Of course, yeah.
So you alluded to this, but then we'll discuss.
Sorry.
So on the birth certificate, you take mother.
You take the father's race and ethnicity if it's reported. I'm following again. You take the father's race if it's recorded and assign it. If it's not recorded, you take the mother's. Okay, well, I did that for both 90 and 2000 here.
How do you do the ATS then? Because you have to decide which rate. You take the reported rate for the child now?
Oh, you mean when you're simply using the ACS?
When you get ATS,
Yeah.
how do you, the child's rate?
Child's race is what the parents report. Yeah. I mean, so, and it's same with the census, right? The decennial, right? Like the race, it's self-reported. So yeah, you're right. That's a different way. But the problem is that in the decennial, both in the decennial and the ACS, and this, I kind of alluded to this earlier when I tried to do undercount by characteristics of the mother. You can't confidently identify the mother in the household. Even if you in the census. So I'm gonna speak a little ill of IPUMs right now. Don't use the mother's location variable in your work, right? So they try. There's a lot of 98-year-old mothers of infants. Yeah. And I tried to do it myself, but I couldn't do any better, right? So that's why I abandoned trying to break this down by more interesting characteristics like characteristics of the mother, because there is mother's education is reported on the birth certificate in many states. It's just so that we know, right? Like assuming it's properly reported and all that stuff. It's just that identifying which person in the household is the mother is hard, and there's also the issue of, it's the education of the mother on the birth certificate. If the child is not residing in the same household as her mother, or his or her mother, their birth mother, I mean, that's also an issue we can't really deal with.
Yeah, because when you get into the issue of ethnicity and the final registration in birth certificates, then you do get into problems with the final registration.
Yeah.
And then, let me tell you, in North Carolina, because I was having all these different numbers. And so I actually called the viral registration, and it turns out that they asked to the mother, it's Hispanic, and if they're married or not.
Mm-hmm.
And if the mother says they're single, and say who's the father, and he says because maybe they're not legally married.
Yeah.
This person next to me.
Mm-hmm.
But then, what's his name? Something. They ask for ID for
Mm-hmm.
the father. Otherwise, the registered they have no father, because it turns out they're trying to protect false or trying to claim.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
And so when they get into viewing the father's information into these things to get an investigation, in many cases they don't register the father.
Yep.
Because that's what I do.
Yeah. So that's
these things, and then what the source for Hispanic, maybe there is something about some from the vital registration system.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that's why, like, in my exercise here, I don't explicitly use these estimates to adjust for the undercount, because I don't trust them for reasons like this as well as others. That's why I'm simply doing the assumption sort of method, because, but once again, I may be misidentifying Hispanic status of some of those kids that I'm adjusting. That's absolutely true.
Is there any other age group where census actually don't count well, but actually we can count them well from other sources? So I'm actually trying to find out the benchmark here actually, in a sense. For instance, I'm actually looking at these college students or populations, in fact, whether how much they can actually count from this census. Actually.
You can't.
Right. And then you probably know well about this, the college students number.
Yes.
So then that way we can think of, again, I'm just trying to see, is that the only from the 0 to 5 issue, or is that like there's some group there where you can even find even more worse actually the case where we actually have no good number of college students in this country because there's actually missing. So,
well, it's actually an overcount of college kids, I would argue, is what, and this has been speculated on, and when you see it, if you, like in my original dissertation paper, like I used this method to go up to age 18 in 2000 because I could by state of birth, and it was age 31 actually in 21. Sorry, it was a while ago. And there you actually see once you hit ages 18 to 22, right, the college ages, we actually overcount non-blacks pretty substantially, and that's because their parents are recording them, college students, and they're being recorded in their dorm. The exception there are black men. Once you hit age 18, the undercount goes to 15%, and it stays there until they reach older ages. And that is not prisoners, because we can count the prison population pretty well. And I would refer you to that job market paper out of Harvard by Con Lang. She does a very good job. That was going to be the next paper for me, right? Is looking at, but she does a much better job, I think, than I would have done, because she uses this great data on from some crime data. I don't exactly remember the name of it, but in order to approximate the characteristics of the men that were missing, and does a pretty good job in terms of approximating what those people look like.
One portion I would say, if you use the SES, it does a terrible job counting people in food water.
Yeah.
It's well known.
Yeah.
But going back to the ACS, this is the old, now we don't have the long form.
No, we don't have a long form. We've got the ACS. I would say that they're just as wrong as the decennial. There's no reason to expect that the ACS would be better or worse than what we see in the decennial. In fact, it could be worse. People are less, it would be like one of the best days of my life if I ever get an ACS form in the mail, right? Like, I would be so excited to fill that out. But a lot of people, they're like, what is this, right? And so I suspect the non-response is even higher for the ACS than for the decennial, simply because fewer people know about it, right? There's no hype.
But there's a lot of internet responses now for the ACS.
Yep.
trying to get the cost-cutting mode, they're really trying to get as much as possible, even if this one maybe a few so much.
Yeah.
I don't know, they may have internal documents where they will get the data. I don't think that response rate storage here has come down.
That's good. I didn't know that. That's good. That's good.
So I make a two-second speech. I mean, this on the heels of Steve's talk is a reminder, you're always like cutting like these bad people don't report this. These awful conservatives are gonna put this thing. So, but you know, some of this is all our fault. I mean, because in some sense, we wanna run regression so bad with individual characteristics and so on, that we essentially, you know, took the devil that would give us more independent variables at the risk of essentially not counting people.
Yep. Yep. No, you're absolutely right. I think, and this is, I tell my.
But it's Mitch
Okay, well,
I mean, but you know,
Oh yeah, so I tell my undergrad. Okay, I tell my students this. Like, you shouldn't always. I mean, we take the data for granted, and we don't, and we shouldn't, and that's the point of this paper.
Okay, let me just say something. Okay. We can't throw it all out either.
No.
I mean, it is the best data.
It's what we've got.
We need to understand its limitations. We need to be careful how we use data. We need to check the quality to the extent we can. But that doesn't mean that we should throw all these data under the bus.
Yes.
So I know you didn't say that, but all I'm saying
I just
is
think
that
there's more to life than regressing everything on
everything else.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you all.